It was a quiet evening in the city. The sun had already slipped below the skyline, leaving behind a warm orange glow that slowly faded into the deep blue of night. Streetlights began to flicker on one by one, spreading soft light over the nearly empty roads. It was that peaceful time between rush hour and nightfall when the city finally took a breath. Judge Denise Carter was driving home after a long day at the courthouse. Her car, a silver sedan that had seen better days, hummed steadily beneath her hands. She didn't mind that it wasn't new or fancy. It was comfortable, familiar, and reliable, much like her routine. She had bought it years ago, back when she was still working as a public defender, long before she ever imagined herself sitting behind the bench in one of the city's busiest courtrooms. The day had been heavy. 3 hearings, 2 family disputes, and 1 criminal case had left her mentally drained. She loved her job, but some days took more from her than she could easily give back. As she drove, she tried to let her mind wander away from the courthouse, from the tense faces and tearful eyes that filled her courtroom every day. The night air outside was cool. She rolled down her window slightly and let it brush across her face. Her favorite jazz station played softly on the radio, helping her unwind. It was a small ritual she had after every long day, just her, the music, and the open road. She had nearly reached the quiet part of the highway that curved toward her neighborhood when she saw the flash of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. For a moment, she didn't think they were meant for her. She looked around, expecting the patrol car to pass, but the lights stayed behind her, flashing insistently. Her stomach tightened. She signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. The jazz faded into silence as she turned down the volume. She checked her speedometer. She hadn't been speeding. She wasn't on her phone. Everything was in order. Still, she knew the drill. Keep calm, stay polite, don't make sudden moves. A door slammed behind her. She could see the officer's silhouette in her mirror, tall, broad-shouldered, walking with a quick, firm stride. The beam of his flashlight danced across the back of her car, up to her rear window and then to her side mirror. She rolled her window down halfway and rested both hands on the steering wheel. "Good evening, officer," she said calmly. The officer stopped beside her door, shining his light directly into her face. His tone was clipped and sharp. "License and registration." Denise nodded and reached slowly into her purse, making sure her movements were deliberate. "Of course," she said softly. "May I ask why I was stopped?" "You were doing 10 over the limit," he replied. "And you drifted toward the shoulder back there." She frowned slightly. She knew she hadn't been speeding. "I see," she said, handing him her driver's license and registration papers. "I didn't realize." The officer barely glanced at the documents before looking her over again. "Is this your car?" "Yes, it is," she replied. "I've had it for years." He gave a short, skeptical nod. "You sure about that?" "It's registered to a Denise Carter." "That's me," she said evenly. "Judge Denise Carter." He paused for a fraction of a second, then smirked faintly. "Right," he said, clearly not believing her. "Sit tight." He walked back to his cruiser without another word. Denise watched him in the mirror. His attitude stung more than she wanted to admit. She had been through countless encounters with law enforcement in her professional life, but always from the other side of the courtroom. Sitting there on the side of the road, treated like a suspect, she felt a deep ache of frustration. Still, she kept her composure. Getting angry would only make things worse. The minutes dragged on. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights sweeping over her car and then disappearing into the dark. She could see the officer sitting in his cruiser, typing something into his computer, glancing up at her every now and then. She wondered if he was running her plates or if he was just taking his time to make a point. When he finally returned, his flashlight was back in her eyes. "You got any idea how fast you were going?" he asked. "I believe I was within the speed limit," she replied calmly. "Around 35. It was 45, he said flatly. "You were going 55. Denise took a breath. "I'm sorry, officer, but I'm quite certain I wasn't." He leaned slightly closer. "Are you arguing with me?" She shook her head. "No, sir. Just saying what I remember." "Then you remember wrong," he said curtly. "You people think you can talk your way out of anything." Her chest tightened. She knew exactly what he meant by "you people," but she refused to react. Instead, she said quietly, "I'm simply trying to understand the situation." He sighed, scribbled on his pad, and handed her a citation. "Court date's in 2 weeks," he said. "Don't be late." She looked at the ticket, then back at him. "Thank you, officer," she said softly, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. He gave a short, dismissive nod and walked back to his car without another word. The patrol lights faded as he drove off, leaving Denise sitting in the dark with only the soft hum of her engine for company. For a long moment she didn't move. She felt a swirl of emotions, embarrassment, frustration, and something deeper that she couldn't quite name. She took a deep breath and started the car again. The jazz station was still playing, but the music no longer felt soothing. The notes felt hollow. She turned it off and drove the rest of the way home in silence. Her neighborhood was quiet, lined with old trees and warm porch lights. She parked in her driveway and sat there for a minute before getting out. The night air felt cooler now. She looked down at the ticket in her hand, the officer's name scribbled at the bottom. She read it twice, folded it neatly, and tucked it into her bag. Inside, her home was calm and familiar. The faint scent of lavender candles hung in the air. She kicked off her shoes, hung her coat, and stood in front of the mirror for a moment. The reflection staring back at her was that of a composed woman. But beneath that calm surface, she could still feel the sting of being treated like she didn't belong, like she needed to be reminded of her place. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of the refrigerator. She thought about the officer's tone, his assumptions, his words. She wasn't angry exactly. It was something more complicated, a sadness mixed with disbelief. She had spent her entire career upholding the law, believing in fairness, believing that respect should go both ways. Yet in that moment, none of it had mattered. She knew she hadn't been speeding. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. But she also knew there was little point in arguing on the side of a dark road. People see what they expect to see, she thought. After a while, she went into her study and opened her notebook, a place where she sometimes jotted down thoughts after a long day. She wrote the date and time, then every detail she could remember about the stop, the location, the officer's badge number, his words, his tone. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she believed in documentation and truth. As she wrote, her mind went back to something her mentor once told her years ago, when she was still a young attorney. There will be moments when the robe won't protect you, when people won't see the title, only the surface. That's when your character will speak louder than your credentials. She smiled faintly at the memory. That advice had been meant for the courtroom, but it fit this moment perfectly. When she finally put the pen down, it was nearly midnight. She closed the notebook, finished her tea, and turned off the lights. Before heading to bed, she paused by the window and looked out at the quiet street. Somewhere out there, the same officer was probably back on patrol, unaware of who he had just pulled over, unaware of the lesson waiting for him. Denise didn't wish him ill. She didn't even plan to file a complaint, at least not yet. She believed in the system she served even when it failed her, but she also believed in accountability, and she knew that sometimes the most powerful lessons come when truth meets consequence. She turned away from the window and whispered to herself, almost like a promise. "We'll see this through." The house settled into silence as she walked down the hallway to her room. The distant sound of crickets filled the night, and for the first time that evening she felt her shoulders relax. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she had seen something she would never forget. How quickly judgment could replace respect. How easy it was for someone to see authority only in a uniform, not in a person. As she drifted off to sleep, the flashing lights still flickered in her mind. But beneath them there was also clarity, a quiet understanding that what had just happened wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something much bigger. And though she didn't yet know how the story would unfold, she knew one thing for sure. When truth finally found its place, everyone would remember the night a judge sat silently on the side of the road, waiting for justice to circle back to her door. The next morning came quietly. Soft light crept through the blinds and landed on the edge of the kitchen counter where Denise stood, holding a steaming cup of coffee. The air smelled faintly of roasted beans and rain, the kind of morning smell that usually made her feel grounded. But not today. Her mind kept circling back to the night before, to the sharp tone of that officer's voice, to the disbelief in his eyes when she told him her name. She took a slow sip of coffee and sat down at the table. The traffic ticket lay right in front of her, folded neatly, almost too neatly. She had read it twice already. The handwriting was rushed, the ink slightly smudged. A small detail, but something about it bothered her. Not because of the fine or the accusation of speeding, but because of what it represented, an assumption, a judgment made without knowing the person behind the wheel. She took out her notebook again and reread the notes she had made the night before. Every word she had written still felt heavy and real. Then she closed it gently and reminded herself to let go, at least for now. She had a courtroom waiting for her and people who needed her attention. The drive to the courthouse that morning was calm. The sun had broken through the clouds and the city was beginning to stir awake. People hurried across streets, buses hissed at stops, and shop doors opened one by one. Denise turned on the radio for company, but her mind wasn't on the music. She wondered how many people woke up every morning thinking about small moments of disrespect that they simply had to swallow. When she arrived at the courthouse, she greeted the security officers at the entrance. They smiled warmly, nodding as she passed through the metal detector. They all knew her, not just as a judge, but as someone who took the time to ask about their day, who remembered birthdays and small victories. That kind of respect came naturally to her. In her chambers, she hung her coat and sat at her desk. The walls were lined with books and framed photos. Her parents, her law school graduation, her first day as a judge. She ran her hand across the desk for a moment before opening her case files. There were 3 hearings scheduled before lunch. Family court, a custody issue, a probation review. Real people, real problems. Once court was in session, she shifted effortlessly into her role. Her voice was calm but firm, her presence steady. She listened carefully, asked questions, and made decisions rooted in fairness. For those few hours, the world outside her courtroom didn't exist. But between cases, her mind would wander back to that dark road and the officer's cold stare. She reminded herself not to carry it into her work. Still, a small part of her wanted to believe that there was a reason she had experienced that moment. Life had a way of teaching lessons in unexpected ways. By late afternoon, court had adjourned. Denise gathered her files, signed a few documents, and leaned back in her chair. She rubbed her temples and thought about the upcoming traffic hearing she'd have to preside over next week. The usual minor violations, parking disputes, routine citations. She had done hundreds of them before, but this time the thought brought a strange sense of curiosity. That evening, she met her friend and colleague, attorney Rachel Ward, at a small cafe downtown. The 2 women had known each other since law school, and often met after work to talk about everything except work, though somehow, they always ended up back there. "You look like you've had a long week," Rachel said, stirring her tea. Denise smiled faintly. "Just one of those days that don't quite leave your mind." Rachel tilted her head. "Something happened?" Denise hesitated for a second. "I got pulled over last night." Rachel's eyes widened. "You, what for?" "Apparently speeding." "Though I wasn't," Rachel frowned. "Did the officer recognize you?" "No," Denise said, shaking her head. "And I didn't tell him until he asked if the car was mine. Even then, he didn't believe me." Rachel sighed, setting her cup down. "That must have been uncomfortable." "It was more than that," Denise admitted quietly. "It was disrespectful." But I kept calm. There's no point arguing on the side of the road. Still, I can't shake how easily he dismissed me. Rachel leaned forward. "Are you going to do something about it?" Denise shrugged. "I haven't decided. Maybe it's not about doing something. Maybe it's about remembering." Rachel nodded slowly, understanding more than Denise said. "Well," she said softly, "some lessons come back around in their own time." That line stayed with Denise long after they parted ways. The next few days passed quickly. Work filled her time, but every now and then she'd think of that patrol car, that flashlight, that look of disbelief. It wasn't about ego. It was about respect, something she had built her entire career on. One evening, she decided to check the schedule for upcoming traffic hearings. She glanced down the list, reading names and case numbers until her eyes froze on one entry. Her heart gave a small jolt. Officer Brian Miller, Traffic Citation Review. The same name that appeared at the bottom of her ticket. For a few seconds, she just stared at the screen, uncertain whether to laugh or sigh. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of humor. She leaned back in her chair and thought about it carefully. It wasn't her case yet, but she knew how the rotation worked. Judges were assigned randomly, and it was entirely possible she'd be the one to handle it. The thought brought a quiet calm rather than anger. If that moment ever came, she knew exactly how she'd handle it. with fairness, with dignity, and maybe, just maybe, with a lesson that would last longer than a lecture ever could. Days rolled by. Each morning she put on her robe, her calm expression, and her patience. The courthouse became its usual rhythm of motion. Clerks shuffling papers, lawyers pacing in the hallway, the faint buzz of conversation before each case began. One afternoon, as she walked through the lobby, a young woman approached her nervously. "Judge Carter, yes?" Denise turned with a warm smile. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said. "You handled my brother's case last year. You gave him community service instead of jail time. He's doing really well now. He wanted me to tell you that." Denise's heart softened. "That means a lot. Tell him I'm proud of him," she said. Moments like that reminded her why she loved what she did. The system wasn't perfect, but every small act of fairness made a difference. That night she sat on her porch with a book she barely read. The hum of distant traffic blended with the chirping of crickets. She thought about how strange life could be, how quickly roles could shift, how one night you're on the side of the road being questioned, and the next you're behind the bench questioning others. A week later, she received her finalized docket for the upcoming week. Her eyes paused midway through the list, and there it was again. Officer Brian Miller, traffic enforcement testimony. She smiled faintly, not out of spite but out of quiet awareness. Life had completed its circle faster than she expected. When the day finally arrived, she woke early. She took her time getting ready, buttoning her robe slowly, her reflection calm and focused. She wasn't thinking about revenge or embarrassment. She was thinking about accountability, about how every person deserves to learn what respect truly means. At the courthouse, the air buzzed with its usual mix of chatter and urgency. Clerks organized files, officers checked schedules, and lawyers whispered last-minute advice to their clients. Denise walked into her courtroom, greeted the bailiff, and took her seat. "Good morning, Your Honor," her clerk said, handing her the schedule for the day. She scanned it briefly, her eyes stopping at one familiar name. Her heart didn't race. Instead, she felt a calm sense of readiness. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about something larger, how moments of misunderstanding could turn into moments of truth. As the cases began, she moved through each one smoothly. A parking ticket, a license renewal issue, a speeding fine. Her words were steady, her tone even. Then, as the clerk called the next case, a slight hush fell over the room. Next case, State versus Carter, citation issued by Officer Brian Miller. The door at the back opened, and the officer stepped in. The same man who had stood beside her car a week earlier now walked into her courtroom, unaware of what waited for him. He wore the same uniform, the same confident expression, until he looked up and saw who was sitting behind the bench. Their eyes met for just a moment. His confidence faltered. He blinked, unsure if what he was seeing was real. Denise gave no visible reaction, just a calm, professional nod. "Good morning, Officer Miller," she said. Her voice carried the same calm authority it always did. But this time, the weight behind it was unmistakable. The courtroom went completely still. The moment hung in the air, quiet but powerful, the beginning of a lesson that neither of them would ever forget. The courtroom was quiet enough to hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. The sound of papers rustling stopped the moment the clerk called the next case. Everyone turned as the door opened, and Officer Brian Miller walked in, holding his cap in one hand and a folder in the other. He looked every bit the confident police officer, back straight, jaw firm, eyes forward. But that confidence began to slip the second his gaze landed on the bench. Sitting at the front of the courtroom, wearing her black robe and calm expression, was the same woman he had pulled over days earlier. Judge Denise Carter. For a brief second, time seemed to freeze. The memory of that night flashed through his mind. The flashing lights, the tone he had used, the disbelief in her words when she had said she was a judge. Now there was no mistaking it. She was indeed the judge. His judge, Denise, didn't react right away. Her face was composed, her tone neutral as she said, "Good morning, Officer Miller. Please approach." He swallowed hard and stepped forward. The courtroom, sensing something unusual, grew even quieter. A few people in the gallery exchanged quick glances. They could feel something in the air, though no one dared to whisper. Denise turned slightly toward her clerk. Let's proceed, she said. The clerk nodded and read out the details of the case. It was routine, a citation for speeding issued by Officer Miller. The defendant was listed as Denise Carter. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Denise leaned back slightly in her chair and folded her hands. Officer Miller, she began softly, please recount the details of the traffic stop that led to this citation. His voice wavered slightly at first. Yes, Your Honor. On the evening of the 10th, I was patrolling near the corner of Main and Oak. I observed a silver sedan traveling over the posted speed limit. I initiated a traffic stop and issued a citation for speeding. Over the speed limit by how much? She asked. He cleared his throat. 10 miles per hour, Your Honor. And were there any other traffic violations? He hesitated. The driver drifted slightly toward the shoulder. Denise nodded slowly. I see. Did you happen to record the stop? He blinked. Excuse me? She met his eyes calmly. Your patrol vehicle is equipped with a dash camera, correct? Yes, Your Honor. Then there should be a video record of this incident. He shifted uncomfortably. Yes, there should be. Denise glanced toward the bailiff. Please have the footage queued up. Within minutes, the small monitor on the side of the courtroom flickered to life. The dashcam footage began to play. The sound of the patrol car, the flashing lights, the moment Denise's car pulled over. All of it was there, perfectly clear. Everyone watched in silence as the footage continued. The car wasn't speeding. The speedometer reading was visible, steady and within the limit. There was no drifting toward the shoulder. And when the officer approached the car, his tone was sharp, dismissive. His words, caught clearly by the camera's microphone, filled the courtroom. You people think you can talk your way out of anything. The sentence hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. Officer Miller's face turned pale. When the video ended, Denise let the silence stretch for several long seconds. Then she looked at him steadily. Officer Miller, is this the same incident you just described under oath? His voice was barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. Would you say your report was accurate? He hesitated. Not entirely, Your Honor, Denise nodded. Thank you for your honesty. She leaned forward slightly, her tone still calm, but her words carried weight. Officer Miller, the court appreciates the work that law enforcement officers do. It is a difficult job that demands integrity and patience. However, what I see in this footage troubles me deeply. He didn't respond. His eyes stayed on the floor. You approached a driver with hostility, she continued, her voice even. You made assumptions without evidence. You dismissed her words not because of her actions, but because of your perception of who she was. Do you see that? He swallowed hard. Yes, Your Honor, she nodded. And when that driver told you she was a judge, you didn't believe her. Why do you think that is? He hesitated again. I didn't expect it, Your Honor. Didn't expect what? She asked gently. He glanced up at her, his voice quiet. That she'd be someone like you. The room was completely still. Denise didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Someone like me, she repeated softly. What do you mean by that, officer? His shoulders tensed. I meant someone important. Someone with authority. Her gaze stayed steady. I see. You didn't see authority when you looked at me that night, did you? He shook his head slightly. No, Your Honor. Thank you for being honest. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then she looked toward the gallery. This courtroom operates on a single principle, respect. It is given not because of titles or uniforms, but because of humanity. Every person who enters this room, defendant, officer, lawyer, or judge, deserves to be treated with dignity. Her tone softened slightly, but her words were firm. We all wear something that represents authority. Some wear a badge, some wear a robe. But these symbols mean nothing if we forget the respect that must come before them. The courtroom stayed silent. Even the air felt heavy with reflection. She turned back to the officer. Officer Miller, the citation you issued is invalid, as the evidence clearly shows. I will dismiss this case. He nodded, his expression tight with embarrassment. Yes, Your Honor. However, she continued, before I close this matter, I want to make something clear. What happened that night isn't just about a speeding ticket. It's about perception. You looked at me and saw a profile, not a person. I hope this moment helps you see how dangerous that can be. He nodded again, more slowly this time. I understand, Your Honor. Good, she said quietly. Because understanding is the first step to change. For the first time since entering the room, he met her eyes directly. There was something different in his gaze now, less pride, more humility. "I want to apologize, Your Honor," he said softly. "I was wrong. Completely wrong. I spoke out of line and I misjudged you. I'm sorry." Her expression remained calm. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "But I hope you carry that lesson with you. Not for my sake, but for every person you meet on duty." "Yes, Your Honor," he replied. Denise nodded once, then turned to the clerk. "This matter is closed. Court is adjourned." The sound of the gavel echoed sharply through the room. The people in the gallery stood slowly, still processing what they had witnessed. Some looked at each other, others looked down, thinking. It wasn't often that a courtroom moment felt so personal, so raw, yet still so respectful. As the bailiff called for order and the crowd began to file out, Officer Miller remained standing by the table, unsure of what to do. He waited until the room was nearly empty before he finally approached the bench. "Your Honor," he said quietly. Denise looked up from her papers. "Yes, officer?" "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for not embarrassing me, for teaching me something instead." She gave him a small, understanding smile. "Growth doesn't happen through humiliation, Officer Miller. It happens through realization. You faced your mistake. That's the beginning." He nodded slowly, his voice sincere. "It won't happen again." "I believe you," she said. "Now go do your job with a little more compassion than before." He nodded again, then turned to leave. As he walked out of the courtroom, he felt lighter somehow, though the weight of his mistake still lingered. For the first time in a long while, he thought about what it really meant to wear a badge. Denise sat quietly after he left. The courtroom was empty now, the echoes of the day fading into silence. She took a deep breath and leaned back in her chair. She wasn't proud of having been disrespected, but she was proud of how she had handled it, with dignity, with restraint, and with purpose. She thought about all the people who never got that same chance to be heard, to be seen, to have someone confront bias in a space where truth couldn't be ignored. Maybe this small moment would ripple outward. Maybe one changed mind could lead to another, and another. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon light streamed through the tall windows. She watched as Officer Miller walked down the steps and stopped for a moment, looking out at the city. He took a deep breath, adjusted his uniform, and walked away slowly, different from the man who had walked in. Denise smiled faintly. Justice wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about awareness, about the kind of understanding that changes a person from the inside out. And in that quiet, sunlit courtroom, she knew something important had happened that day, not just for him, but for everyone who believed that respect, when given freely, can be the truest form of justice. After the courtroom emptied, Denise remained seated for a few moments, letting the silence settle around her. The faint hum of the lights overhead was the only sound, punctuated occasionally by the shuffle of a late clerk organizing papers. She closed her eyes briefly and exhaled, letting the tension of the morning slide away. Even in moments of triumph, she reminded herself to stay grounded. Justice, she had learned, was never about pride. It was about fairness, about teaching lessons that extended beyond the courtroom walls. Officer Brian Miller had left the room visibly shaken, but there was something in his posture that gave her hope. He hadn't stormed out in anger, hadn't challenged her authority, and hadn't tried to defend his earlier behavior. He had faced the truth, and in doing so, he had taken the first step toward change. Denise knew that lessons learned through humility lasted far longer than any reprimand could deliver. As she stood and began to gather her notes, a thought lingered. This moment could have been over in a matter of minutes, dismissed as just another traffic citation, but it had the potential to resonate, to become a turning point for someone who carried authority and responsibility every day. She wanted it to matter not just for Officer Miller, but for every person who might one day walk into her courtroom with the weight of assumptions on their shoulders. Later that afternoon, Denise returned to her chambers. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper, the familiar scent grounding her as she sat at her desk. She opened her notebook and began to write, detailing not only the events of the traffic stop and the courtroom hearing, but also her thoughts on accountability, respect, and the subtle biases that could cloud judgment. Writing was her way of processing, of turning a single experience into something meaningful. She wrote about the power of words, the influence of tone, and how authority could be misused without even realizing it. She reflected on the idea that respect wasn't earned simply by holding a title or wearing a uniform. It was cultivated through actions, patience, and understanding. And she thought about the courage it took to face mistakes openly, to admit when one had been wrong. By early evening, the courthouse was quiet again. Denise stepped outside to the steps, letting the cool breeze brush against her face. The city hummed softly below, its lights beginning to sparkle as dusk settled in. She watched as people walked by, some hurrying home, others pausing to talk or laugh with companions. In that moment, she thought about the ripple effect of one small interaction. One act of disrespect, one confrontation, one opportunity for understanding. It could reach far beyond what anyone expected. The next morning, Denise returned to the courthouse early. There were files to review, hearings to prepare for, and staff to meet with. Yet a part of her mind remained on the events of the previous day. She anticipated seeing Officer Miller again in some capacity, though she didn't know if it would be formal or incidental. Either way, she resolved to handle the encounter with the same measured calm she had shown in court. As she walked through the lobby, she noticed a few officers gathered near the entrance. They were speaking quietly, some glancing toward her with curiosity. She recognized the murmured names, the whispered speculation, and she understood it all without needing words. People noticed change. People noticed lessons delivered with dignity. And that kind of awareness spread quickly, sometimes faster than any official memo or directive could. She entered her chambers and began organizing her notes for the day's hearings. Her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague, congratulating her on the way she handled the situation with Officer Miller. Denise smiled faintly. It wasn't about praise. It never was. It was about the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had stayed true to her principles. By mid-morning, court was in session again. Denise presided over cases ranging from minor disputes to traffic hearings. Each one required her attention, her empathy, and her calm authority. Yet beneath the routine, she remained aware of the subtle shift that had occurred, not just in the courtroom but in the people around her. Officer Miller's moment of realization had already begun to ripple outward, quietly influencing others in ways she couldn't yet see. During a brief recess, she stepped into the hallway to speak with a staff member. They discussed upcoming schedules and procedural matters, but Denise's thoughts drifted to the idea of teaching beyond the courtroom. How could lessons of respect, humility, and fairness be communicated in everyday life? She realized that the answer often lay in simple actions, listening, acknowledging, and confronting bias when it appeared. That afternoon, Officer Miller returned for administrative purposes. This time, he entered the courtroom with a noticeably different demeanor. His steps were measured, his eyes more focused, and there was a subtle hesitancy that hadn't been there before. Denise observed quietly from her bench, noting the change without comment. When the session began, she addressed the courtroom in her usual professional tone. "We are here to ensure fairness and accountability," she said. "Every action, every word carries weight. Remember that respect is not given lightly, but it is a responsibility we all share." The officer took his place to provide testimony for a routine case. His answers were measured, respectful, and precise. It was clear that he had reflected on the previous encounter. He maintained composure even under questioning, demonstrating a level of self-awareness that had been absent before. After the case concluded, Denise called him aside privately. "Officer Miller," she said quietly, "I want to acknowledge the effort you're making. What you demonstrated today shows growth. It shows that you understand the responsibility that comes with authority." He nodded, almost relieved. "Thank you, Your Honor. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I want to do better." "I know I need to. That's all anyone can ask," she replied. "Understanding and action are the first steps. Keep that in mind in every encounter you have." He hesitated, then spoke again. "I also want to apologize once more for the way I treated you. I know it was wrong. I should have treated you with respect from the start." Denise smiled faintly. "Apology accepted. Now take that lesson and let it guide your work. That's where it will matter most." As he left the courtroom, Denise returned to her bench. The weight of the day's events lingered, but it was no longer tense. It was hopeful. The moment had been transformed from one of confrontation to one of reflection and potential growth. She understood more clearly than ever that justice was not only about the law, it was about people. That evening, she returned home and reflected on the entire sequence of events. She realized that true power lay not in authority or titles, but in the ability to guide, to correct, and to teach through example. Moments of disrespect could be transformed into lessons of understanding if approached with patience and clarity. She made a mental note to continue documenting these experiences, not just for herself, but for others who might face similar situations. The notebook on her desk had become a repository of wisdom, reflection, and insight, a tool for growth, both personal and professional. As she prepared for the next day, Denise thought about the broader implications. How many people encountered bias or assumptions daily? How many acted out of habit without realizing the impact of their words or actions? She felt a renewed sense of purpose. The courtroom was not just a place for legal decisions. It was a space where human behavior could be guided toward fairness and respect. Days passed, and Officer Miller's demeanor continued to shift. Reports from other officers indicated a change in how he interacted with the public. He asked questions more patiently, listened more carefully, and demonstrated awareness that hadn't been there before. Denise learned of these changes through casual conversations with staff and colleagues. She didn't seek recognition, but the results quietly reinforced her belief that one moment, handled correctly, could influence much more than expected. One afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor at her chambers. Officer Miller had come to speak privately, outside the formality of court. He thanked her again, not for forgiving him, but for showing him the importance of respect and accountability. They spoke about everyday interactions, about the subtle choices officers make, and about how small decisions could ripple outward into larger impacts. Denise listened carefully, offering guidance where appropriate, always maintaining her calm, authoritative demeanor. "You've made a difference," he said quietly. "No," she replied. "You've made a difference by choosing to change. That's what matters." The conversation ended with a handshake. There was no lingering tension, no embarrassment, only understanding. The lesson had been delivered, and it had been received. In the days that followed, Denise noticed other small but meaningful changes in the courthouse. Officers approached citizens with a softer tone. Lawyers were more mindful in their language, and even the mood in the hallways seemed slightly lighter. She didn't claim credit. She understood that growth was not linear and that change often begins quietly, imperceptibly, in small choices made consistently. One evening, sitting at her desk with the sun setting outside her window, Denise reflected on the power of calm, thoughtful response. She understood that she had not only addressed a single instance of disrespect, but had also created a teaching moment that could influence behavior far beyond what she could see. She smiled softly to herself, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The encounter had transformed from a moment of personal frustration to a catalyst for understanding and growth. It had reminded her why she had chosen this profession, not for recognition, not for authority, but for the opportunity to guide, to teach, and to shape fairness into action. And in that quiet room, surrounded by papers, books, and the faint hum of city life beyond the walls, she felt a profound truth. Justice was not only measured in verdicts and fines, but in the way people learn to see, respect, and treat one another. The days following the courtroom incident passed quietly, yet the ripple of change was unmistakable. Denise returned to her routine at the courthouse, attending to cases, speaking with staff, and guiding hearings with her usual calm authority. But there was a subtle difference in the air. People seemed to move with more consideration. Officers who had previously seemed brisk and impatient now spoke more deliberately. Lawyers paused before cutting one another off mid-argument. Even the young clerks walking through the hallways carried themselves with a quiet awareness that had not been there before. Denise noticed these changes without taking credit. She understood that the lesson had extended beyond the direct interaction with Officer Miller. The way she had handled the confrontation, without anger, without humiliation, and with undeniable fairness, had set an example for everyone who witnessed it or learned about it later. In the city's courthouse, where tensions often ran high and tempers flared, such examples were rare, and they were powerful. One afternoon, she was walking through the lobby when she noticed Officer Miller speaking quietly with a colleague. He turned and spotted her, his expression shifting from professional composure to a subtle hint of recognition. He nodded and she nodded back. There was no need for words. The acknowledgement was enough. Over the past week, Denise had seen him acting differently in court, more measured, more mindful of how his words and actions affected others. It was a small transformation, but visible to those who paid attention. That evening, Denise returned home and sat on her porch with a cup of tea. The sun had just dipped behind the rooftops, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The city's distant hum was soothing, a reminder that life continued beyond the courthouse walls. She reflected on the events that had unfolded: the traffic stop, the sharp words, the courtroom confrontation, and the quiet, profound change that had followed. It occurred to her that these moments of learning often came in unexpected ways. The traffic stop had seemed trivial at first, almost routine. Yet, it became a turning point, not because of the law but because of human connection, accountability, and the willingness to reflect and grow. The lesson had not been delivered with anger or punishment, but with clarity, respect, and unwavering professionalism. That was what made it resonate so deeply. A few days later, Officer Miller requested a private meeting with Denise. She agreed, curious but open-minded. When he arrived, he seemed nervous, his usual confident posture softened by the weight of reflection. "Thank you for seeing me, Your Honor," he said quietly. "Of course," Denise replied. "Have a seat." He took the chair across from her desk and exhaled slowly. "I wanted to say thank you again, not just for what happened in court, but for how you handled it. I've been thinking a lot about that moment, and it's changed the way I approach my work." Denise nodded, listening carefully. She had seen many people apologize, many people promise to change, but the true measure of growth was in how it manifested in everyday actions. "I realized," he continued, "that I can't let assumptions dictate how I treat people. Every interaction matters. That night, I didn't see the person in front of me. I saw a stereotype, and that was wrong." "I'm glad you see that," Denise said softly. "Awareness is the first step. Action is the next. The way you treat people moving forward will define whether this lesson truly takes hold." "I understand," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "I've started noticing my own reactions more. I'm asking questions, listening carefully, and trying not to let my assumptions control my judgment. I've even shared this experience with some colleagues, and it sparked conversation about how we interact with the public." Denise allowed a small smile. "Good. That's exactly how change begins, quietly, intentionally, and through example." They spoke for some time longer, discussing ways that law enforcement could incorporate mindfulness and respect into daily duties. The conversation was calm and thoughtful, with neither needing to assert authority over the other. It was a genuine exchange, a moment of mutual understanding that extended the impact of what had started as a simple traffic stop. Later that week, Denise reflected on how remarkable it was that a single encounter could lead to such meaningful change. She thought about the countless people in the city who interacted with authority figures daily: teachers, police officers, managers, and others. How often did those moments become opportunities for growth rather than conflict? How often did small acts of understanding ripple outward to create a better environment for everyone? She realized that the lesson extended far beyond Officer Miller or even the courthouse. It was about human behavior, the responsibility each person had to recognize their own biases, and the power of responding with calm clarity instead of anger. These principles, she thought, were just as vital in everyday life as they were in the courtroom. One afternoon, a mother approached Denise after a family hearing. Her son had been struggling with school attendance, and Denise had guided him toward community programs and mentorship rather than punishment. The mother thanked Denise sincerely, describing how her son had started to change, how he had begun to see himself differently. Hearing that, Denise thought about the connection between her work and Officer Miller's growth. In both cases, it wasn't about asserting power. It was about guiding, teaching, and offering a path forward. It reinforced her belief that respect and accountability, when delivered thoughtfully, could create positive change in ways that punishment alone never could. By the end of the week, Denise noticed subtle differences in the courthouse atmosphere. Officers were calmer in their interactions with citizens. Lawyers spoke with more patience. Even defendants seemed to sense a quieter, more respectful tone when they entered the courtroom. It was not dramatic, but it was significant. Small changes were often the most enduring, she thought. One evening, after a long day, Denise returned home and sat on her porch once more. She watched as the city lights flickered on, one by one, casting a warm glow over the streets. She thought about the chain of events, the traffic stop, the unfair assumptions, the courtroom confrontation, and the quiet, profound impact it had created. It was a story she would carry with her, a reminder that change often begins in small, unexpected ways. Her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. "Officer Miller spoke highly of you today. He's making a real effort to improve." Denise smiled faintly. She didn't need accolades. Seeing tangible change even in small ways was enough. Later, as she sipped her tea and watched the sunset fade into night, she reflected on the larger lesson. Respect, she realized, wasn't conditional. It wasn't about status or titles or authority. It was about recognizing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their role, background, or appearance. When people were treated with dignity, even when they had been wrong, they had the capacity to grow, to reflect, and to change. She thought about Officer Miller again. He had made mistakes, but he had faced them. He had taken responsibility and reflected on his actions, and in doing so, he had created a ripple of awareness that extended far beyond their single encounter. It reminded her that transformation often came quietly, but it was no less powerful. In the following weeks, Denise continued to witness the effects of that change. Officer Miller's approach to policing became more mindful. Other officers began to observe and learn. Staff and colleagues noted a subtle shift in how interactions were handled. What had begun as a single moment of disrespect had grown into a catalyst for awareness, dialogue, and reflection. One day, Denise received a letter from a community organization praising her for her handling of the situation. The letter emphasized how her calm, thoughtful response had inspired conversations about fairness, respect, and accountability in everyday life. Denise read the letter and smiled. She didn't seek recognition, but it was affirming to know that the principles she lived by could inspire others. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on her desk. Then she opened her notebook, jotting down reflections on human behavior, the impact of words, and the importance of patience in moments of conflict. Writing helped her process, turning experiences into insights that could guide future decisions and inspire others quietly. Months later, she would still think of that evening traffic stop, not as a negative memory but as a turning point. It reminded her that justice was never solely about law. It was about humanity. It was about seeing beyond assumptions, acknowledging mistakes, and using moments of conflict as opportunities to guide, teach, and inspire. And sometimes the smallest moments became the most significant. A single encounter, handled with calm authority and respect, could ripple outward, touching lives in ways that were invisible at first but undeniable over time. Denise stood at her window one evening, looking out over the city. The streetlights flickered softly, and somewhere in the distance an officer walked his beat, more aware, more patient, more respectful. She smiled quietly, understanding that true justice was measured not just in verdicts or citations, but in the subtle, lasting ways people changed when treated with dignity. She whispered to herself, almost as a promise, "Let respect guide us even when it is not demanded. Let fairness shape our actions even when it is difficult. Let humanity lead always." In that quiet moment, Denise felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The experience had taught her and others that change was possible when patience met clarity, and when respect was extended even to those who had faltered. And in that understanding she found hope, not just for her courtroom, but for the world beyond it. She knew that lessons like these, though they often began in small, unnoticed ways, had the power to endure. They could shape behavior, influence perspectives, and over time create a culture of understanding, empathy, and accountability. And that was the most lasting impact of all, the kind that no gavel, no badge, and no courtroom could ever fully measure, but one that touched lives quietly, persistently, and profoundly.